"Who let the beggar fish in this lake?" Karen Whitmore pointed a citation at Maurice Langston's face like it was a loaded gun. "And who are you supposed to be? The lake's owner? Or just someone fantasizing about controlling black folks?" Maurice replied with a cold smile. That morning, he was fined $500 by the HOA for daring to drop a fishing line into the lake near his home. 48 hours later, he bought the lake and posted a bright red sign: "Fish free or die. HOA MAD." The entire neighborhood fell silent. Karen screamed, but the power dynamic had flipped. This time, she couldn't stop anyone. This wasn't about fishing. It was about who gets to tell you that you don't belong in a place you've lived your whole life. Have you seen something like this before? Then answer this. What state are you in? Does this kind of thing happen where you live? Follow for more to see how the HOA got banned in return. This story doesn't end with money. It ends with freedom. Early in the morning, the lake lay still beneath a thin layer of mist, stretching past rows of ancient willows, the sunlight not yet harsh, only beginning to cast a soft gold on rooftops less than 100 meters from the shore. Maurice Langston sat on a stone barely rising above the grass, fishing rod resting loosely, the water clear as glass reflecting his image gently. Each of his breaths seemed to blend into the quiet of the air. In the thermos beside him, the coffee was still hot. It was the morning of someone who belonged here, someone who had lived through enough summers and winters to know Greenfield Lake was always calmest at this hour. But that calm didn't last. The sharp whine of a golf cart cut across the grass, coming toward him as if dragging a harsh wind behind it. The cart stopped. Karen Whitmore stepped down with the air of someone who never walked unless it was to issue orders. Clipboard in hand, she didn't need to look at the lake, didn't need to look at him. She stared straight at the fishing rod and spoke as if reading a ticket already printed. "Do you have a card? This lake isn't for outsiders." Maurice didn't rush. He set his coffee down, stood slowly, and holding the rod with the same ease as one would hold a stalk of grain. He turned to face her, neither avoiding nor retreating, voice calm. "I live at number 30, 9 Willow Court, right behind the hackberry trees. I've been here since before your house got its first repaint." The words weren't meant to provoke. They were simply the truth, and truth always unsettles those who live on borrowed authority. Karen squinted. She didn't ask questions, didn't check an address, didn't verify. She pulled out a pre-printed form, scribbled a few lines, then tossed it straight into his bait bucket. HOA violation, using shared property without a valid membership card. Fine, $500. Then her voice turned sharp. "If I see you here again, you won't just lose your fishing spot." That last sentence wasn't part of any policy. It didn't represent any rule approved by residents. It was just a personal threat. Maurice picked up the citation, stared at the $500 amount for a long moment as if looking at something faded, then slid it into his shirt pocket. He said nothing more. Karen turned away. The golf cart whined again, this time dragging a bitter silence in its wake. In that moment, the lake was still beautiful, the sky still wide, but something had shifted beneath the surface, not from rod or fish, but from the man himself. Karen turned off the grass path, unaware she had just triggered something far beyond $500. She thought she had enforced the rules, but in truth, she had just set off a chain of events that couldn't be undone, because no one can predict what happens when a black man, fined without cause in what used to be his own home, chooses to fight back not with shouting, but with ownership. Maurice didn't head back right away. He stayed seated, rod resting in its holder, hand on the wooden ledge, eyes gazing far off like he was measuring the tide. He didn't look toward his house, didn't glance in the direction the golf cart had gone. He looked at the water, and in that moment, the surface became a question. When power is abused long enough, is silence still a choice, or just a form of compliance? Each willow leaf falling onto the lake echoed a truth he had known for years. No one hands you justice. Justice has to be claimed. He stood up, unhurried. He folded the rod, grabbed the bait bucket, and turned away from the lake as if it were the last time he'd sit there as just another resident. The citation stayed in his pocket, not crumpled, not tossed, because he planned to use it for something much bigger, not to appeal, but to prove to the entire neighborhood that rules can be rewritten if the one holding the pen knows the worth of the ink. And he knew Karen wouldn't stop at one fine, but he didn't plan on stopping at one calm reply either. Because if someone could be fined for fishing in the place they've always called home, then the people making the rules could be forced out of the power they've grown used to holding. That day, no fish bit, but something bit back at the system, and the system would not stay the same. Not after Maurice Langston rose from that stone. Not after a man fined $500 chose to settle the score by buying the entire lake. The next morning, Greenfield Lake no longer looked clear as usual. The early breeze didn't carry the familiar cool scent of damp grass and water, but something sharp and sour that made passers-by wrinkle their noses. The mist hadn't fully lifted when dozens of dead fish began surfacing along the shore, white streaks shimmering in the sunlight, not with the vibrant glint of life, but with the bloated stillness of corpses, eyes clouded, bellies swollen. A maintenance worker stood on the grass, holding a net, lifting the fish one by one into a large black trash bag. He wore no name tag, his face young and sunburned, voice raspy as he spoke into his phone while collecting bodies. They treated the blue-green algae, dumped too many chemicals, forgot to notify the residents. Maurice stood a few meters away, asking nothing more, needing no clarification. He looked at the lake, or rather, at what was slowly dissolving in its water. Fish don't die for no reason, and silence doesn't stay sealed by accident. As the sun rose higher, light struck each peeling scale, and the gradually fading murk spread from the center of the lake to the edge. Maurice turned and left the lawn without a word to anyone. That evening, at the emergency HOA meeting held at the clubhouse, the room with only 30 chairs was packed. The smell of old plastic and cheap perfume mingled with the lazy hum of ceiling fans. Karen sat at the head of the table, microphone in hand, while Maurice took a seat in the far back corner. He didn't want to sit close, didn't need a front row to see her clearly, because what mattered wasn't in her face or gestures, it was in the words. And this time, he didn't plan to stay quiet. When Karen began her report, lake maintenance was carried out as scheduled. Maurice stood up. His voice cut through the room before it had fully settled. Who approved this round of treatment? I'm asking clearly. Which committee member signed off on dumping chemicals into the lake? Karen flinched slightly, quickly composed herself. She set the microphone down, folded her arms, and replied like a teacher scolding a defiant student. You're not on the committee. You don't have the authority to question internal decisions. A few murmurs rose from the back, but no one spoke up in agreement or opposition. An older man with silver hair and a slight stoop, sitting in the second row, spoke. Fish are dead, but the people stay silent. Are we really keeping this hidden too? Karen didn't turn to look at him, didn't acknowledge him. She spoke into the microphone with a flat, rehearsed tone. This lake is HOA property. The rules are ours. The room fell into a heavy silence. People glanced around, but eyes didn't meet for long. Everyone knew that wasn't right, but who would be the first to stand and call it what it was? Maurice didn't reply to Karen. He didn't have to. He simply turned his head toward the door, where the sign posted just yesterday still hung clean, free of dust. Private dock, members only. 4 white-painted capital letters on dark red wood. A direct message to anyone who once believed the lake belonged to the community. That sign wasn't just a rule. It was a boundary between those with a card and those being pushed out. Between those who control the rules and those who nod in fear. Maurice looked at it like he was seeing a symbol of something he had long suspected but never seen this clearly before. Greenfield wasn't a neighborhood, it was a territory, where power was handed out based on skin color and the ability to obey. And the most dangerous thing wasn't the sign, but the calm acceptance of those who walked past it every day without question. The meeting ended with no decisions passed. Karen left first. No one dared stop her, but no one saw her off either. Only the young worker who had collected the dead fish earlier that morning quietly stepped in to clear the chairs, hands still smelling faintly of chemical. Maurice was the last to leave the room. He wasn't thinking about the fish anymore, or Karen's words. He was thinking about what would happen if people kept letting her believe the rules are mine without pushback. Maybe it all started there, with a sentence swallowed back, with a sign put up that no one took down. But if it started with things that small, it could also end with something just as small. A look, a question, a land record. Maurice knew, to change a system you can't strike the surface. You have to break the core. And the core of Greenfield was the lake itself. If the HOA could use the lake to write rules, it could use the same lake to break them. But next time, he wouldn't ask who signed the approval. He would be the one giving it, as the legal owner. The story of the dead fish spread in a single day, but their death didn't shock anyone. It only made people uncomfortable, because it reminded them of a truth the entire neighborhood had learned to ignore, that the HOA's power didn't just come from rules, but from people putting up with them. And when someone starts asking, why hasn't anyone been held accountable? It means that tolerance is starting to crack. Maurice didn't need anyone to riot, he just needed them to start asking questions. He would handle the rest because he had already started, and he wouldn't stop at fishing. On Monday morning, every Greenfield resident found a new subject line in their inbox. Simple but ominous. Important notice regarding Greenfield Lake access. Below was an email from Karen Whitmore, this time in her official capacity as HOA president, sent to over 300 households. Due to delays in lake maintenance fee contributions, starting today, any resident who has not completed the $75 fee for this month will be temporarily restricted from accessing the lake area. Violations will be addressed according to board policy. No explanation, no legal reference, no clear reason why this fee had suddenly become urgent. Just an order, issued by someone far too used to being obeyed without question. Maurice read the message, then read it again. He didn't feel anger or even sarcasm, he just felt cold, not from the threat itself, but from the silence wrapped around it. In the resident forum, no one dared push back. A few soft comments appeared. Was this fee ever voted on? Or, who approved this increase? But all of them were quietly removed by Karen from the official group. Maurice understood this wasn't just a fine, it was a gag. No one was allowed to talk about the lake, walk near the lake, or even think about the lake unless they paid. Not because the HOA needed money, but because they needed to prove that a single command could make an entire community shrink, like fish in a net. But that very day, while Karen sat in her small office gazing at the lake through her window, somewhere else in the same city, Maurice was seated at the Department of Natural Resources. In front of him was a folder stamped in red, Unregistered Natural Zone, Code 06 Bell, Area, Greenfield Lake. It stated clearly that Greenfield Lake was not private property. It was public land, temporarily managed by the HOA under city permit, but without any legal deed of ownership. Meaning they could maintain it, care for it, but they had no right to impose enforcement rules or financial penalties on residents. Any fees related to lake access had to be voted on by the community under democratic procedure. In other words, Karen's warning emails had no legal standing, and the HOA had been acting like they owned the lake, when on paper, they were only borrowing it. Maurice left the building with a copy of the file, sunlight catching on his glasses like the world had suddenly sharpened, not from the weather, but because he now knew. The rules of the game had changed. Back in the neighborhood, he ran into Ryan, the young man from the number 40 row who often played badminton by the lake in the afternoons. Ryan was taking out the trash when he paused at the sight of the folder in Maurice's hand. "You got that email too?" Ryan asked. Maurice nodded, then held out one of the sheets from the stack. "You know, they don't own the lake, they just control it through fear. And do you know what's the first thing to fall when people stop being afraid? That private dock sign." Ryan gave a hesitant smile, eyes still unsure, but something in Maurice's voice kept him from turning away. That evening, the air was still. The lake lay motionless, not a ripple in sight. Maurice pulled his fishing rod from the shed, used steel pliers to remove the hook, wrapped everything neatly in an old cloth bag, then walked out to the lakefront. He wasn't fishing. He just stood there, looking at the water, once a quiet morning joy, now the center of a battle over the meaning of power. Garden lights cast soft, blurred streaks of yellow across the surface. Someone walked past in the distance, paused, then kept going. No one called his name. No one stopped him. He stood for a while longer, then set the cloth bag down on the wooden step leading to the lake, and sat on the same stone bench as always. His hand rested on his knee, palm open as if ready to receive something larger than himself. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't need to, because he already knew. "Tomorrow," he whispered, voice just loud enough for the breeze to hear, "this lake will have a new owner." Not because he wanted to win against Karen, but because he wanted to end the cycle where rules were written by those who believed white skin meant permission, and tomorrow, the private dock members-only sign would still be there. But it would no longer be a warning, it would be proof. Proof that one day, someone stood up in a neighborhood that believed it was untouchable, and rewrote ownership with nothing but quiet certainty. 1 week after the police encounter, the seemingly calm waters of Greenfield Lake began to stir quietly. But this time, the movement didn't come from golf carts or Karen Whitmore's sharp commands. It came from files being submitted in silence at the County Department of Natural Resources. Among the steady stacks of printed forms, one file under the legal entity H Environmental Holding LLC was processed swiftly thanks to paperwork prepared in advance, and behind that name was none other than Maurice Langston. He didn't use his real name, nor did he leave any direct link to the shell company formed months earlier. A clean entity, no record, no baggage, registered in a state hundreds of miles away, and fronted by an independent attorney. Every detail was handled discreetly, so even the clerk processing the file had no idea the man behind the papers was once stopped by police for fitting a description. And Greenfield Lake, previously listed as unassigned natural property, was now officially transferred to H Environmental Holding under the designation of Sustainable Management with rights to intervene, restore, and control access. Maurice stepped out of the government building in an old suit, carrying no papers, as everything had already been delivered directly to the law office. His phone buzzed, a message from the legal representative: transfer complete, maintain silence per agreement, contract sealed until public release. He replied with one line, "Let them sing their song one last time." And in that moment he knew, the HOA's soundtrack was nearing its final note, and none of them realized the main performance had never been theirs to begin with. While Maurice stayed silent, the HOA board grew louder than ever. On Friday afternoon, every household in the neighborhood received a digital bulletin, written written and signed by Karen Whitmore, with a bold red headline, New Lake Access Rules, effective next week. The message stated clearly, each household must now pay $150 per quarter to retain access to Greenfield Lake. This regulation was internally approved by the HOA Executive Board and will take effect on the 1st of next month. Violations will result in revoked access, administrative action, and may incur penalties under the bylaws. No legal citation, no reference to budget allocation, just another sweeping mandate, but this time, with a fee double the previous one, residents began to stir. Some replied to the email, asking why the fee had suddenly increased. Others voiced frustration in the community message group. Doesn't the HOA own the lake? What gives her the right to charge everyone? Didn't someone say the lake wasn't private property? But those questions were quickly removed by Karen from the official forum. She sent out a reminder stating that all unapproved comments will be subject to review under the HOA disruption policy. No one knew that, at that very moment, in a small stone engraving workshop 10 miles away, a new nameplate was being finished. The words were sharply engraved into the surface of deep black granite. Langston Lake, ownership confirmed. The city emblem sat neatly in the lower left corner, with the official access code printed beneath. No ornamentation, no color, just certainty, cold and lawful. Maurice didn't bring the sign home immediately. He left it there for 3 more days, until the official fee notice had arrived by mail at every household. When the paper proof was in everyone's hands, he picked it up. No announcement, no ceremony, no press release. He hired a crew to install the sign exactly where private dock members only had once hung. They came early in the morning, before the sun rose. When Karen stepped outside, as usual, for her morning walk around the lake, she froze. The new sign had already been installed. Below the name, 3 small words, under new legal stewardship. And on the old hoe post, only rust marks remained where the screws had been removed, as if no one had ever claimed ownership here. No residents had been notified in advance, but when they stepped outside, when they walked their dogs or took their kids to the park by the lake, they all stopped. They read. They stood silent. Then they began to ask each other, and for the first time in months, the question was no longer, who made the new rule, but, what's happening here? Maurice did not appear at the sign. He stayed home, reading, sipping tea, letting the facts do the rest. No one needed to declare victory. But those who had once been threatened over a fishing rod could now see clearly. Power doesn't lie in who shouts loudest, but in who knows when to stay silent, and rewrites the rules with signatures pulled from the mud. And from that day on, Greenfield Lake was no longer its official name. People began calling it something new. The name of the man who bought it without noise, without threats, just by staying within the law and refusing to back down, Langston Lake. 1 week after the police encounter, the seemingly calm waters of Greenfield Lake began to stir quietly. But this time, the movement didn't come from golf carts or Karen Whitmore's sharp commands. It came from files being submitted in silence at the County Department of Natural Resources. Among the steady stacks of printed forms, one file under the legal entity LH Environmental Holding LLC was processed swiftly, thanks to paperwork prepared in advance. And behind that name was none other than Maurice Langston. He didn't use his real name, nor did he leave any direct link to the shell company formed months earlier. A clean entity, no record, no baggage, registered in a state hundreds of miles away, and fronted by an independent attorney. Every detail was handled discreetly, so even the clerk processing the file had no idea the man behind the papers was once stopped by police for fitting a description. And Greenfield Lake, previously listed as unassigned natural property, was now officially transferred to LH Environmental Holding under the designation of Sustainable Management with rights to intervene, restore, and control access. Health. Maurice stepped out of the government building in an old suit, carrying no papers, as everything had already been delivered directly to the law office. His phone buzzed, a message from the legal representative, transfer complete, maintain silence per agreement, contract sealed until public release. He replied with one line, let them sing their song one last time, and in that moment he knew, the HOA's soundtrack was nearing its final note, and none of them realized the main performance had never been theirs to begin with. While Maurice stayed silent, the HOA board grew louder than ever. On Friday afternoon, every household in the neighborhood received a digital bulletin written and signed by Karen Whitmore with a bold red headline, New Lake Access Rules, effective next week. The message stated clearly, each household must now pay $150 per quarter to retain access to Greenfield Lake. This regulation was internally approved by the HOA Executive Board and will take effect on the 1st of next month. Violations will result in revoked access, administrative action, and may incur penalties under the bylaws. No legal citation, no reference to budget allocation, just another sweeping mandate, but this time, with a fee double the previous one. Residents began to stir. Some replied to the email, asking why the fee had suddenly increased. Others voiced frustration in the community message group. Doesn't the HOA own the lake? What gives her the right to charge everyone? Didn't someone say the lake wasn't private property? But those questions were quickly removed by Karen from the official forum. She sent out a reminder stating that all unapproved comments will be subject to review under the HOA disruption policy. No one knew that, at that very moment, in a small stone engraving workshop 10 miles away, a new nameplate was being finished. The words were sharply engraved into the surface of deep black granite. Langston Lake, ownership confirmed. The city emblem sat neatly in the lower left corner, with the official access code printed beneath. No ornamentation, no color, just certainty, cold, and lawful. Maurice didn't bring the sign home immediately. He left it there for 3 more days, until the official fee notice had arrived by mail at every household. When the paper proof was in everyone's hands, he picked it up. No announcement, no ceremony, no press release. He hired a crew to install the sign exactly where private dock members only had once hung. They came early in the morning before the sun rose. When Karen stepped outside, as usual, for her morning walk around the lake, she froze. The new sign had already been installed. Below the name, 3 small words, under new legal stewardship. And on the old HOA post, only rust marks remained where the screws had been removed, as if no one had ever claimed ownership here. No residents had been notified in advance, but when they stepped outside, when they walked their dogs, or took their kids to the park by the lake, they all stopped. They read. They stood silent. Then they began to ask each other, and for the first time in months, the question was no longer, who made the new rule, but what's happening here? Maurice did not appear at the sign. He stayed home, reading, sipping tea, letting the facts do the rest. No one needed to declare victory, but those who had once been threatened over a fishing rod could now see clearly. Power doesn't lie in who shouts loudest, but in who knows when to stay silent, and rewrites the rules with signatures pulled from the mud. And from that day on, Greenfield Lake was no longer its official name. People began calling it something new, the name of the man who bought it without noise, without threats, just by staying within the law and refusing to back down, Langston Lake. That morning, before the first rays of sunlight touched the water, Langston Lake witnessed a strange scene, not because of noise, but because of the contrast between stillness and motion, between the power that had once been imposed and the new authority now quietly asserting itself. A small group of young people stood on the grass near the lake, phones in hand. They didn't say much. They were filming. Their cameras pointed toward Karen Whitmore, who was rushing in from the parking lot, yelling as she came, "You are not allowed near the water. Leave the lake area immediately. You're violating the rules." Her voice was sharp and high, but the man she was shouting at paid her no attention. Maurice Langston sat calmly on a folding chair, pouring tea from a thermos into a wood-toned ceramic cup. In front of him, a new sign was planted into the soft earth, the bold letters reading, "Fish free or die." No logo, no explanation, just a clear, firm message, direct and unapologetic. The livestream camera followed Karen's every step, then panned to Maurice, then slowly zoomed in on the sign. "This is the same woman who fined him $500 for fishing," the young man whispered, now screaming for him to leave the lake that he owns. The audio captured it all, the soft ripple of water, Karen's sandals scuffing the stone path, the tea pouring into the cup, and Karen's nearly unhinged tone. "That sign is fake. You can't do this. I'll sue. I'm the legal representative of the HOA." The next shot showed a group of residents standing on the far side of the lake, some with crossed arms, others holding phones, none stepping in. A middle-aged woman shook her head. "What's going on?" "He bought the lake, literally, with a proper nameplate." Another voice chimed in. "Who's she going to sue? The owner of the lake?" And slowly, their attention shifted from Karen to Maurice, and for the first time their eyes held no doubt, only recognition. Less than 2 hours later, the video was posted on a popular neighborhood forum. The caption read, "She fined him $500 for fishing. He bought the whole lake." The post spread at lightning speed. Within 6 hours, the video had over 4 million views and nearly 200,000 shares. Local news outlets picked it up, each with their own spin, a quiet victory over HOA abuse, or when ownership belongs to the one who was threatened. Karen, after seeing the footage, immediately submitted a legal takedown request to the forum, claiming the video was misleading and defamatory toward a community representative. But the backlash only grew stronger. Under the articles, the comments poured in. One resident wrote, "I got fined for flying my state flag too big. I finally feel free." Another added, "Karen should step down. Thanks to her, we lost the whole lake." That evening, the HOA meeting opened under heavy tension. Karen opened with a long speech about community dignity and the right to protect shared property. But when she asked, "Who here is willing to file a claim with the county to take the lake back?" the room fell silent. No hands went up. A tall man in the back row spoke. "We never owned the lake. Not then, and definitely not now." A woman seated near Karen added quietly, "You shouldn't have fined him. Now no one's on our side. Karen gripped the microphone, but her lips trembled. She seemed ready to say something else, then said nothing. The air in the room grew thick, not with argument, but with the absence of anyone left to defend a collapsed illusion of control. Meanwhile, Maurice remained at home. He didn't need to appear on camera. He didn't need to explain. The clip spreading online had done all the work. He simply turned a page, poured more tea. On the table sat a small scrap of paper, scrawled in ink. It wasn't the lake that made me win. It was they who thought it would always be theirs. In a society where voices are often bought with titles, sometimes a single share button carries more weight than an entire speech. And at Langston Lake, once seen as property controlled by a few, it had now become a symbol of something else. That some things aren't taken back through lawsuits, but through quiet, decisive, well-timed action. Maurice didn't say much, but the sound of a signpost driven into the ground had made an entire neighborhood look up. Not to argue, but to ask themselves, who have we given power to for too long without realizing it? 3 days after the clip titled, "She fined him $500, he bought the whole lake," spread across social media, the atmosphere in the Greenfield neighborhood had completely changed. The once quiet streets now buzzed with broken conversations between clusters of neighbors, all aware of what had happened, but none saying it out loud. Karen Whitmore no longer carried her usual air of authority. Instead, every time she stepped outside, the people who once nodded politely now avoided her gaze or looked away. On the white iron gate of her home, a printed sign hung from red plastic ties. "Oh, a president must resign." Below it, handwritten notes read, "We are not represented. Give the lake back to the community. We didn't authorize you to start a war." The weekend HOA meeting had only 7 attendees, 4 of whom were board members, the rest being a few remaining residents from a group that once numbered dozens. There was no pledge of allegiance, no loud roll call. Karen sat at the center, flipping through meeting notes as if to calm herself, but no one cared about the agenda anymore. An older woman, once a supporter of Karen, suddenly stood up. Her voice was low, firm. "I've lived here since 1995. I walk around the lake every morning. Now I have to avoid it because Karen thinks she's queen. And how long have we let that happen?" The room fell silent. Karen looked at her, lips pressed tight, then slowly spoke. "Everything I've done is for the community, to maintain order, to keep the lake from turning into a flea market." The woman didn't answer. She turned and walked out, leaving behind an emptiness that stretched into an almost unbearable silence. At that same moment, the local noon news aired footage of Langston Lake, now officially listed in the property registry. The anchor's tone was flat, without commentary. "A resident has legally acquired ownership of Greenfield Lake from the county, following confirmation that the lake was never registered as a privately managed HOA asset." The new title was finalized earlier this week and made public on the government property portal. Alongside the report was an image of the engraved stone, "Langston Lake, ownership confirmed." The report struck at the very core of Karen's credibility, built over more than a decade. No longer a rumor, no longer a viral clip. This was an official government record. And with it, every HOA-issued restriction, fee demand, and lake access rule became invalid. Those who had been fined, excluded, or silenced now, stood vindicated without saying a word. Karen leapt from her chair as the broadcast ended. She called her lawyer, then the land office, her voice filled with anger and disbelief. "Who is he to own the place I've managed? Why didn't the county notify me? How could we, the people running the HOA, not be consulted at all?" But the only reply on the other end was the same. "The lake was never HOA property. You have no authority over the legal transfer process." That afternoon, a group of residents gathered quietly outside Karen's front yard. No protest, no signs, just silence as they stood facing her door. They didn't need to say anything. Their presence alone was enough for Karen to understand that everything had shifted, and this time, no one wanted to pull the rope of assumed power with her anymore. That evening, in online resident forums, a single post spread widely. "We didn't lose the lake because Maurice bought it. We lost it because Karen believed she could speak for everyone without asking anyone." The comments below stretched for hundreds of lines, each with a personal account, being fined for pitching a fishing tent, being told their grandkids couldn't play near the lake due to new rules. But this time, they weren't isolated complaints. Together, they formed a statement, clear and undeniable. Karen closed her laptop. She sat in the dark, no lights on, listening to the sound of insects outside. She had never imagined that a fishing sign and what seemed like a harmless citation could lead to this point. But even she couldn't deny one truth. Things didn't collapse because Maurice had too much money, but because she had abused a kind of power she never truly held, the power to silence others. And when those who had once stayed silent finally began to speak, even a small lake could become the place where a much larger truth surfaced, the truth about who was actually chosen and who merely assumed they were in charge. On Thursday afternoon, Karen Whitmore appeared on camera for a local television station, first public presence since the Langston Lake incident spread across social media. Despite her neatly styled hair and heavy makeup, the tension in her eyes was unmistakable. The broadcast aired live, drawing more than 10,000 concurrent viewers, not because people cared about the HOA's position, but because everyone wanted to hear what Karen would say now that her authority was unraveling piece by piece. She began with a low, steady tone, trying to maintain composure. "I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to tell the truth." The host nodded, giving her the floor. Karen continued, "I'm not prejudiced. I don't discriminate. I just follow what the rules say, and the rules always have belonged to us." The host paused for a few seconds, a slight furrow in his brow. Then he asked, "Us? Who do you mean by that?" Karen pressed her lips together, eyes shifting quickly, as if searching for the right words. But instead of clarifying, she blurted out in a hesitant breath, "The people, like me, the people who know what keeps a community safe, clean, and from changing too fast." In that moment, the studio froze. The host said nothing. He gave a small nod and turned to the camera. "We'll let the audience decide for themselves." Just minutes after the broadcast ended, the clip of Karen's words was trimmed, lightly edited, and reposted across multiple platforms. The caption was brief: "I'm not prejudiced. The rules just belong to us, the people like me." From TikTok to Reddit, Twitter to neighborhood Facebook groups, the video spread like wildfire through dry brush. Everyone understood the message beneath the polite language. Karen didn't need to say white, the entire country heard it anyway. A Greenfield resident who had never posted before wrote a short sentence on their page. For the first time, she told the truth. Below it, hundreds of comments poured in. One user wrote, "She's not sorry. She's just sad the old power can't protect her anymore." Another added, "Law isn't supposed to shield discrimination. It's supposed to protect fairness. And people like her have twisted it for years." In less than a day, the Greenfield HOA announced it was suspending operation. The website was locked. The inbox is disabled due to overwhelming backlash. The remaining board members resigned in unison, one of them stating plainly in a letter, "I joined to support community management, not to be dragged into Karen Whitmore's personal games of power and control." Karen vanished. She didn't return home. She didn't go to her usual grocery store. Her golf cart was found parked crooked outside a local sports field, the steering wheel coated in dust. Online, rumors spread that she was staying with her sister in another state. One resident joked, "If she calls this a vacation, it's the first one she can't charge anyone a fee for." But Karen's downfall wasn't just a personal humiliation. It became a symbol of something deeper, the fracture of an HOA model that had been abused as a tool of control rather than governance. The discrimination once hidden within the bylaws was now exposed through every word, every act Karen had assumed no one would question, because all along she mistook the community's silence for agreement. But in truth, they had only been waiting for someone to stand up. And Maurice did that, not with shouting, but through action, calm and irreversible. The next day, the television station aired a short recap segment, the headline bold across the screen, "From Power to Silence, the End of an HOA Era." On screen was Karen with her head bowed, backlit so her shadow stretched long behind her, as if even she had realized the power she held had never been real. It only existed because others were afraid. And once that fear was gone, all that remained was a microphone with no voice, echoing in a quiet studio. Immediately after the Greenfield HOA announced it was ceasing operations, a group of civil rights attorneys filed an official lawsuit with the county court, calling for an investigation into years of financial misconduct. Leading the group was attorney Angela Baines, who had previously handled a landmark HOA lawsuit in the state of Georgia. At a public press conference held at the community center, she declared, "We have identified signs of over $2 million in unlawful collections over the past 5 years, involving fees without legal basis and missing from any public financial reports." In her hands was a thick file containing financial comparisons, invoices with no listed recipient, and vague expenses labeled landscape lake upkeep or special gate maintenance fee. The investigation revealed that Karen Whitmore, while serving as HOA president, had unilaterally sent notices to African American households in the neighborhood demanding payment of a so-called special waste processing fee. Most residents said they didn't understand why the charge appeared, but paid it anyway to avoid being referred to the HOA disciplinary committee, which Karen chaired. One internal email read, "Some residents tend to produce waste that is harder to manage. Preventive measures are required." Meanwhile, the local sanitation company confirmed that there had never been any distinction in service across Greenfield. The irregularities also included fees that were never discussed at general community meetings. Some meeting minutes were marked, "No new business," even though they coincided with large billing periods. Among the uncovered documents was a contract with Lakeview Solutions, a shell company registered to a mailbox address, signed electronically as KW Management, a name matching the family business Karen once operated before it was dissolved. Angela Baines stated, "When power rests in the hands of an unsupervised group, it creates a system that functions like local government, but without checks, without balance, and without accountability." She emphasized that HOA structures in many areas have been distorted into tools of suppression and profit, and the Greenfield case is one of the clearest examples. Within the community, stories began to resurface, no longer whispered, but openly shared. A middle-aged woman recounted being repeatedly reprimanded by Karen for aesthetically inappropriate plants, and each time she resisted, she was billed a special assessment fee, though no assessment process ever took place. A young Asian American family said they were fined for hosting a birthday party with too many unfamiliar guests, while longtime residents' gatherings were never questioned. Each of these scattered accounts now fits into a larger picture, not just of a woman abusing power, but of an entire structure built on ambiguity and fear. When the lawsuit was filed in court, residents lined up outside as if to witness the end of an era. No one clapped, no one cheered, but there was something different in their eyes, a quiet recognition that the feeling of injustice they once thought was personal had actually been a collective experience, and for the first time, it had been called by its name. The buried files had surfaced, and with them came the chance for each person in the neighborhood to finally face a truth they had long been made to turn away from. Maurice Langston did not appear at the press conference with the legal team, nor did he speak to the media as the accusations against the HOA began to build. He simply sat on the wooden bench beside Langston Lake, the same lake he had once been banned from, watching the still surface as if it had never known disruption. When a reporter found him and asked if he felt he had won, he simply said, "I don't need to win a case. I just need to make sure they can't do it again." The answer was quiet, brief, but quickly quoted across outlets. A local headline read, "He didn't seek justice for himself, he blocked the road back to injustice." Within 3 days of that statement, Maurice's name began appearing in national media. Outlets that usually covered finance or culture were now publishing stories about an ordinary man who was fined for fishing, then quietly bought the lake and brought down an entire model of discriminatory authority. One feature on the front page of the Atlanta Review was titled, "The Man Who Bought a Lake to Give Freedom Back to the Community." The article didn't focus on finances or legal strategy, but on something simpler. Some people don't rise because of rage, but because they know silence is complicity, and when they act, the result is not revenge, it's the reordering of something that has long been broken. Maurice offered no further comment. He had no social media, declined all major interview requests. But people found him in clips recorded by residents, footage of a man standing beside a sign that read, "Fish free or die," lifting a fish from his line and releasing it back into the water. Footage of him picking up trash around the lake with 2 neighborhood children. Footage of him silently listening as a group of local teens pitched an idea to turn Langston Lake into a place for teaching life skills to disadvantaged youth. None of these moments was staged, but each was strong enough to fill the space the HOA had once occupied. People began to talk about what other communities could learn from Greenfield. Some proposed forming neighborhood groups with more transparent models, and others suggested returning the management of public assets to city control. But regardless of the solution, the name Langston had become a symbol, not of victory, but of a boundary. The boundary of what people can endure, and the boundary of power built on exclusion. That weekend, a new sign was placed at the entrance to the lake. Langston Lake. No one owns freedom, but everyone deserves to breathe in it. No one knew who wrote it, but residents said, if it wasn't him, who else could have come up with something so right? An older woman said, "This lake is no longer a place for catching fish. It's a place where people are seen." And as the sunset slid across the water, reflecting the silhouettes of those standing there not for rules, not for power, but for a kind of normal that had once been forbidden, everyone understood they were not just witnessing an incident anymore. They were witnessing a beginning. The county court issued its official ruling after 2 weeks of hearings and document review. The Greenfield HOA was found to have committed serious financial mismanagement, violated the charter of a civil organization, and was stripped of all authority over public assets, including Langston Lake and surrounding community spaces. The ruling took effect immediately. The former board was dissolved. All decisions made since 2018 were ordered for review, and the city temporarily assumed control of public facilities previously managed by the HOA. At the court's announcement, announcement, only a few resident representatives attended. No flowers, no television cameras, no long speeches. People stood quietly, nodding as if an old chapter had closed without needing further explanation. Back in the neighborhood, a group of residents organized a small gathering at the lake to mark the end of the days of control. They set up a lemonade stand, a few folding chairs, and a long wooden table with homemade dishes. No host, no background music, but there were kids laughing, adults sharing old stories as a way to lift the weight that had once hung over the place. One middle-aged man brought a rusty fishing rod, saying softly, "They once threatened to cut my power because I leaned my bike against the lake fence. Today, I'm here just to sit near this water for a while." Next to him, a girl around 8 tossed small stones into the lake. No one stopped her. No one reminded her of the old no throwing rocks rule. Maurice Langston did not attend the gathering. No one was surprised. Since his name had become widely known, he had grown quieter. People only saw glimpses of him in the early morning, walking around the lake, stopping where the grass grew thick to pick up trash or adjust the fishing guide signs he'd placed with a group of young volunteers. The afternoon before the thank you event, he left a small sign by the dock. "I don't want to be thanked. I want everyone to be able to fish." Handwritten, plain, no decoration. But residents understood. It wasn't a rejection of gratitude. It was a reminder that courage should not be a medal. It should be the beginning of change. From that day forward, the unreasonable rules were removed, the threatening signs taken down. In their place, city-installed public use guidelines appeared, with one line added, "No one has the right to tell you that you don't belong." An older woman shared, "For the first time in over 10 years, I walked around the lake without feeling someone judging me from behind a window." A quiet teen told his father, "Now it feels like we really have a place to grow up." To many, Maurice had disappeared just as he was being talked about most. But in that absence, everything he had done became more visible than ever. A lake no longer marked by exclusion, but by the gathering of those once pushed apart. No one had to ask permission to sit near the water. No one needed an intermediary to be treated like a citizen. And when the last light of day hit the lake, rippling across the surface, people didn't see the image of a victor. They saw the figure of someone who had stayed silent, so others could finally speak. The media kept circling back to how Maurice Langston handled the entire affair. No high-profile lawsuits, no protest rallies, no fiery speeches. He simply and quietly changed things, one by one, from signage to legal ownership. An editorial in the State Beacon opened with the bold headline, "Langston didn't strike back. He rewrote the rules with bare hands." The article described him as a unique kind of resistance, not explosive, not destructive, but someone who dismantled the system brick by brick with clarity and cold precision. Most people, when fined for fishing, would argue, the piece read, "Langston went and registered lake access rights." When insulted, most would get angry. Langston looked up public land ownership records, and because he did everything without noise, without acting out of spite, the blow he delivered carried all the more weight. People started calling him the man who rewrote rules through the cracks. A civil rights attorney from a neighboring state said in an interview, "His calm left the other side with no way to fight back." Karen wanted a hothead so she could make him the wrong example. What she got was a man with a fishing rod and a legal deed. Across social platforms, clips of HOA overreach, unfair fines, and resident harassment kept resurfacing, tagged with a new hashtag, Langston Effect. One user from Ohio posted, "I don't have money to buy a lake like he did, but I can start by asking questions. Who's writing the rules in my neighborhood? And who do those rules really serve?" Amid the wave, Karen Whitmore still didn't reappear. The house that once hosted HOA meetings remained closed. No comings or going. Some said she'd left the state, others claimed she was under private investigation for misuse of HOA funds, but no one cared much anymore. Her silence was no longer an absence. It was the inevitable outcome after all the layers of pretense had been stripped away. A woman once cited by the HOA for having a non-compliant wooden chair shook her head. Even if she showed up now, no one would care to listen. The one thing she could never control was the truth. The people of Greenfield carried on as if a new cycle had begun. Karen's name didn't come up in gatherings. Instead, they talked about sharing access to common spaces, bringing in legal advice on how to build a transparent neighborhood council, and even running civic skill workshops for local teens. Conversations had shifted from control to competence, from enforcement to accountability. At an informal lakefront meeting, an elderly man took the mic and said, "We've lived too long under the rule of fear. Now it's time to learn how to live through understanding." Oh, Langston didn't attend those meetings, but he still walked around the lake, still adjusted the signs whenever the wind picked up, Still paused for a few seconds when he saw someone sitting by the water for the first time. That presence didn't speak, but it was enough for people to understand. What he left behind wasn't a new form of power, but space for the community to rebuild trust on its own. And in that space, Karen's figure faded further and further, while Langston's voice, though never raised, remained unmistakably clear. The law isn't a leash. It's what we hold together so no one has to bow their head out of fear. Early in the morning, Maurice stepped into the county legal office with a bag full of documents neatly organized by category. In silence, he placed them on the desk in front of the civil complaints investigator and calmly said, "I'm here to report violations of community management bylaws by the HOA in Greenfield." The young attorney was momentarily taken aback not by Maurice's voice, but by the stack of files in front of him, a set of records he had heard about for years but had never seen anyone patient enough to compile in full. Every page marked an illegal change: the lake handling fee, special trash taxes, and maintenance charges, despite financial records never being publicly audited. Maurice had attached them with printed internal emails, unsigned resolutions, and improperly timed notifications. The attorney flipped through the files, pausing occasionally to read a section closely and ask, "How did you get these copies?" "I requested them under the Freedom of Information Act." Each time they stalled, I replied with legal citation. On the 6th try, they sent everything just to avoid a state-level complaint. The answer made the attorney frown, but also nod with respect. "You're the first to bring full documentation. Until now, most people just complained and gave up." Maurice simply said, "I'm not pursuing justice for myself. I'm pursuing it because no one has the right to shred the law just because they think others can't read it." An hour later, the files were sent to the Special Oversight Division to audit the entire operating structure of the Greenfield HOA. The unsigned meeting records once used to justify forced decisions were now being reviewed line by line. Among them was a resolution to fine residents for not cleaning around the lake on weekends, which in practice had forced black families to perform the labor while white households were temporarily exempt. Another document showed lake maintenance fees tripled after Maurice's fishing fine, targeting those with a history of violations, even though no formal warning procedures had ever been established. The deeper the attorney went, the more it became clear. This wasn't a one-off abuse of power. It was an entire layered system, built on coerced silence and vague procedures. Maurice didn't leave the office right away. He sat quietly in the hallway, without a laptop, not looking at his phone, just sitting there, composed, as if the years of living under pressure had taught him a kind of patience few people possess. When a staffer came out to say the legal office would forward the file to both the city's Community Oversight Board and the Finance Department for cross-checking, he simply nodded. Good. From now on, they'll have to sign everything if they want to keep existing. Without noise or media fanfare, Maurice had brought an entire flawed control structure under scrutiny. It was no longer a personal matter, nor just a story about a lake. It was a test of how the law could be bent when those affected failed to speak up. More than anything, it was how Maurice restored faith in the possibility of change through law, through persistence, and through documents that had never been properly signed. Maurice lingered a while after leaving the attorney's office, the afternoon light brushing across the sidewalk outside the city administration building. When a local news reporter happened to walk by and recognized him, she approached and asked what made him invest so much time in a lake that seemed meaningless. He didn't dodge the question or get polite. He answered calmly, "Because most people think the HOA is stronger than the law. I don't." That simple line was recorded, aired on the evening news, and quickly spread. But the bigger impact didn't come from the media, it came from the legal action that followed. Just hours after Maurice's statement, that same afternoon, the city's legal department issued a formal notice, launching an official investigation into the Greenfield HOA under Clause 42.3, a special provision in the Community Code designed to address systematic abuse of power by quasi-official organizations. The notice was sent to every household by email and posted on the Community Center bulletin board, with a clear title, Administrative Investigation Launched, pursuant to Clause 42.3 on asset management and civil liberties. In it, residents were invited to submit evidence or testimony related to coercion, improper fee collection, or any action that had compromised fairness in community life. Those who had been previously harmed by the HOA now had the chance to speak up, and surprisingly, many did. An elderly man who'd been ordered to remove a memorial bench for his wife because it didn't fit the architectural design, a single mother fined for letting her kid bring a skateboard near the lake, and even someone who'd received a written warning for playing classical music on a Sunday morning all showed up. None of the stories was criminally severe on its own, but when assembled together, they painted a troubling picture of a system operating without oversight. Beneath the legal polish of meeting minutes, rulings, and fee statements was a punishing mechanism quietly rooted in discrimination between the outspoken and the silent, between those allowed to speak and those expected to obey. Maurice didn't say anything more, but he attended every hearing. He didn't represent any group, didn't take the mic. He just showed up, sitting at the end of each row, eyes fixed on the people telling their stories. It was a moment where presence alone held meaning. When the head of the investigative team spoke to the press, "We've never received this volume of documents and witness statements for a residential community as small as Greenfield." Maurice's name was not mentioned. But at the end of the article, the journalist closed with a single line. "It all started with a fine being dropped into a tackle box. And from that moment, a man once fined $500 for daring to sit near the lake had turned the entire power structure of a quasi-public organization into the subject of an investigation, not through violence, not through impulsive reactions, but through the ability to prove that laws aren't made to serve those with titles, but to protect those patient enough to see them through. When the official investigation was announced, the silence that had cloaked the Greenfield neighborhood began to crack like peeling paint on a rotten wall. A group of young residents, once considered a minority with no voice, formed the Greenfield Won't Stay Silent collective, starting with a small forum that quickly spread across the neighborhood. Within 3 days, they had gathered over 24 internal HOA emails documents once labeled confidential, now made public as evidence. In one email sent last year by Karen Whitmore herself, she wrote coldly, "We don't need more people like Maurice in the resident records." The language didn't just reveal personal bias. It exposed a prejudice that had silently operated for years beneath the surface of rules and administrative protocols. Soon after, another email surfaced, this time from the HOA secretary discussing plans to raise penalties for behaviors typically seen in residents of color, such as unregistered outdoor gatherings, loud pets, or using public areas after hours. The words weren't vague or hidden behind policy jargon. They were direct and undeniable. Residents who read those emails began sharing them openly, no longer afraid of warnings or being dropped from internal priority lists. They didn't just want to know who had shaped the discriminatory policies, they wanted every name spelled out, one by one, on lampposts, bulletin boards, and the front windows of the local laundromat. Printed screenshots of the emails were pinned up with bold red lettering. "We were once called the kind of people who shouldn't be here. Now it's time they know we never left." Small gatherings began each weekend, unpermitted, no signage, just dozens of people sitting on park benches, reading through the documents together. The mood wasn't angry, it was heavy, deliberate, as if they were revisiting their own memories through someone else's language. Each email was both evidence and a reminder. For years, discrimination hadn't happened in the streets, it had lived in the attachments they were never allowed to see. When a local reporter asked a member of Greenfield Won't Stay Silent whether they planned to sue, the person replied, "We don't need to sue. We need the truth posted on every door." And so, copies of the emails began appearing across homes throughout the neighborhood, not out of hatred, but as a refusal to be erased. Maurice wasn't part of the group, but as he passed by, he stopped and placed a hand on a bulletin board outside the neighborhood library, where a message read, "This is how they saw us. From now on, this is how we see them." Within days, the names once hidden behind titles from president to secretary, approver to bystander were brought into the light. No longer just Karen or the HOA lady, it was now a network with names, signatures, and responsibility. The truth didn't rewrite the past, but it shattered the silence that had once been their most effective weapon. And from that moment, every email, every word they had written in the dark, became proof for the entire neighborhood to see. Rules can be distorted, but memory cannot be erased. News spread even faster than the emails posted on neighborhood gates. A local television station was the first to use the phrase, "biggest HOA scandal in the state since 2009. But within a day, most regional outlets were echoing the headline as confirmation of the story's scale. Headlines flooded the news. Greenfield, from quiet community to civil probe epicenter, fish, files, and bias. An all-American OA story. Journalists began tracking down everyone who had signed the emails, former board members, residents once penalized, each confirmed their involvement, yet no one wanted to say another word about Karen Whitmore. She remained at the center of the storm but was completely absent, no statements, no replies, no resignation letter. Meanwhile, those who once sat beside her on the HOA board began appearing at private city hearing. Under the cold light, they didn't cast blame, but they didn't take responsibility either. Each gave the same answer: "I didn't know it was that serious." One older man, a former HOA treasurer, scratched his head when asked about the discriminatory emails. "I don't recall." Karen sent private emails. I didn't read them carefully. I thought it was just administrative stuff. A woman who once served as secretary said with a shaky voice, I never thought it would go this far. I just followed the template. These testimonies, while not denials, were shields raised to hide passive complicity. No one denied the existence of the biased policies, they simply claimed they didn't realize they were offensive. But offensive? Since when? Since Maurice was fined for phishing? Or since the emails were printed out? Or only when the media picked up the story? Maurice didn't attend the hearings. He didn't send a representative or respond to interview requests. The media described him as the only man in this story who didn't need to face the camera to be acknowledged, calling him the rare figure who required no defense. Meanwhile, what was slowly revealed suggested the truth didn't end with a few emails. A civil legal organization began auditing HOA revenues over the past decade, focusing on the years when Karen was president. They uncovered architectural inspection fees applied only to a minority of residents, mostly Asian, Black, or Latino. A house painting request, submitted by a white resident, had an average review time of 3 days. For residents of color, it averaged 21 days, 35% denied for not meeting community aesthetic standards. Public opinion began to shift. First, the case was dismissed as a minor dispute inside a rule-heavy neighborhood, but now, it was no longer an internal matter. On a major legal forum, a law professor commented, Greenfield is a textbook example of using an HOA as a tool to maintain exclusive power through the bureaucratization of discrimination. No one argued back. No one needed more proof, because what had already been printed and the testimonies of I didn't know were enough to redefine the entire system. Meanwhile, Karen still hadn't appeared. Her house, once the center of HOA meetings, now stayed shut, blinds drawn tight. Yet in that silence, the weight of her name became more visible, because when every witness said, I didn't know, silence itself became the only remaining admission. And the one thing that kept people from going quiet again was that, for the first time, they saw clearly through each line of text, each tone of voice, each administrative decision who had defined them as not belonging in the very place they lived. The story in Greenfield was no longer about a lake and vague rules. It had become a mirror reflecting voices once dismissed as inconvenient, people once forced to adjust their existence to please a select few. A Black father, who had once stayed silent when notified that his daughter's 7th birthday party was canceled just hours before it began, now stood before a crowd with a microphone in hand. They said the sound from our speakers was strange, he said, voice unsteady but holding back tears, and likely to trigger a reaction from surrounding families. But they never banned other backyard barbecues, even when those were louder. The only difference was our skin color. Behind him, his wife held their daughter on her shoulders, the little girl looking up as if relearning the meaning of the word reaction. An Asian American nurse stepped up next. She held out a printed email from the HOA sent the year before, ordering her to remove the bonsai pots from her front porch because they were not aligned with the shared culture. She said, I asked them, what is the shared culture? No one answered. But I knew. The house across the street has state flags and turkey statues out front, and no one says a thing. Applause broke out not for her bravery, but for the truth she spoke that no longer needed to be softened. Under a makeshift tent in the park by what was now Langston Lake, dozens of people took turns sharing stories of exclusion, ones they'd kept to themselves as minor, forgivable incidents in the name of keeping peace. But it was that very peace the Greenfield HOA had exploited for years to construct a shared culture that now everyone could see was simply another name for systemic bias. A brown-skinned teenager held the mic and told how he'd been warned for hanging a flag of his favorite sports team outside his room. They said I hung it wrong. That ruined the community's look. When he finished, someone else raised a hand to share a nearly identical story. The wave of recognition spread not because they'd known each other, but because they'd all been forced into the same silence. There were no tears at the gathering, no fiery speeches. Filled the air most clearly was a sense of awakening, like a forest after a fire, quiet but no longer dark. On a temporary wooden sign were the words, "The ones who are no longer silent." No names listed, no quotes attached, because everyone had a right to be part of it. The media began calling it the Langston effect, the quiet but deep spread of resistance when those once silenced realized the power of telling their own story. Nearby neighborhoods began holding internal dialogues on bylaws, enforcement procedures, and even the language used in violation reports. Several states considered adjusting laws to increase oversight of HOAs suspected of overreach or lacking transparency. But the greatest impact didn't come from legislation. It came from a shift in awareness that the smallest details of daily life, from the sound of a party to the plants on a porch or a flag on a railing, can become the start of exclusion if a community isn't fully awake. Greenfield is no longer the only example, but it is the starting point of a quiet yet persistent unraveling, where each retelling is a brick laid down to rebuild the definition of what it means to be a community. And Maurice Langston, though absent from that day's gathering, was still mentioned. A young boy stood up, gripping a stack of papers. He didn't need to say anything, but because he wasn't afraid, now we get to speak. The county court issued an emergency summons for Karen Whitmore and 3 former members of the Greenfield HOA board, requiring them to appear within 7 days. The summonses were sent to their official residences, but according to reporters on the ground, only one still lived in Greenfield, while the other 2 had moved away after the lake changed ownership. Karen had not been seen since her controversial televised appearance. This summons was not just a legal action, it was symbolic. Silence, evasion, and denial of responsibility would no longer serve as shields. The complaint spanned 8 pages, citing violations of community regulations, financial misconduct, and systemic discrimination based on race and national origin. Local media followed every development, with the morning news running the headline, "Greenfield HOA in the hot seat, community governance or mask for abuse of power." But the person everyone hoped to see in court, Maurice Langston, was absent. Many assumed he was somewhere near the lake, or perhaps had left long ago. One reporter even waited outside his home for hours, hoping for an exclusive comment, but was met only with a neighbor's quiet response. He doesn't live for the camera, he lives for what's right. On the morning of the hearing, Maurice's lawyer appeared before the press and read a single message he had sent. "Don't try her in my name. Try her in the name of what she destroyed." No further comment was made. Yet that sentence spread quickly, becoming a new definition of justice, not revenge, but the restoration of what had been distorted. In the courtroom, Karen appeared stone-faced. She did not admit wrongdoing, only requested that all records be reviewed in the context of their time frame and tenure. But the emails released during the investigation had already made context indefensible. The line, "We don't need more people like Maurice in the resident file," was no longer in a private inbox. It was in front of the judge. One of the other 3 former board members, for the first time, bowed his head and confessed, "I saw that email. I didn't say anything because I thought no one would notice." That admission didn't help his legal standing, but it did open the door to an essential acknowledgement, so the trial would not be a personal defense hearing, but an autopsy of an entire system. Outside the courthouse, the residents of Greenfield didn't gather in crowds, didn't carry signs, didn't shout. They simply stood scattered, watching and remembering. An elderly woman sat on a folding chair, holding a small notebook, and told her granddaughter beside her, "You don't need to understand the law just yet, but remember this, the law won't protect you if you let it be taken." The atmosphere in the neighborhood during the trial wasn't one of resignation, but of clear-eyed observation. They had seen someone dare to buy back what was once taken from him, not to possess it, but to return it to everyone. And now, they wanted to see if the law could do the same. The trial didn't last more than 3 days, but it was long enough for all involved to understand that this wasn't just about a lake. It was about how many other Greenfields existed in neighborhoods where HOA bulletins were only read by those unaffected. When the final session ended, the judge said, "We are not judging a person, we are judging a habit, and from that habit, prejudice takes root." In the silence of the courtroom, that sentence echoed louder than the final ruling. No one knew if Maurice heard it, but maybe he didn't need to, because from the moment he stepped down to the lakeshore, removed the hook, signed the purchase papers under an anonymous legal entity, the story had already been told not through words, but through action. And that action is now the reason this trial happened, not in the name of vengeance, but in the name of restoration. In the morning hearing, Karen Whitmore stepped up to the stand with her hands clasped at her waist, eyes fixed on the tribunal. Without trembling or hesitation, she spoke in a firm voice, "I only upheld the standards of the neighborhood." A short sentence, seemingly harmless, but one that perfectly exemplified the kind of language often used to mask discriminatory practices under the guise of community management. The audience didn't murmur, only sat in a tense silence, just like the HOA newsletters sent by email, full of rules, devoid of humanity. The prosecutor didn't respond immediately. He paused for a few seconds, as if giving Karen a moment to hear her own words. Then, in a slow but razor-sharp tone, he asked, "Which standard requires access to public space to be determined by someone's last name and skin color?" The room went still. Karen tried to maintain eye contact, but the rustle of papers behind her broke her focus. In that moment, the woman who once waved the HOA flag as an untouchable authority was exposed not by an accusation, but by a request to define exactly what she had claimed to uphold. The case documents weren't lengthy, just a few emails, a handful of citations, and some internal notes on how to flag non-compliant residents. But their simplicity revealed the systematic nature of the acts. A power map had been drawn where skin color served as coordinates, and HOA rules formed borders limiting freedom. Karen hadn't signed every controversial document directly, but the tone, language, and implicit approvals all traced back to her. One former board member admitted, she never had to give orders, she'd just suggest, we should preserve the harmony we've always had. That was enough for everyone to understand. Outside the courthouse, the media streamed the hearing live, cutting in with reports on other HOA cases under investigation across the state. Greenfield isn't an exception, one journalist commented. It's just the first place where residents dared to take down the private sign and ask, who put this up? In the backyard of a lakefront home, a family held a small party with balloons and cake, the kind once banned for being aesthetic disturbances. A woman stood at a distance, looking toward the lake, and told a cameraman, I've lived here 32 years. I've never seen the lake this peaceful, not because it's quiet, but because it's no longer ruled by fear. Inside the courtroom, the prosecutor continued, you didn't personally select who got penalized, but the system you led ended up limiting access to public resources for specific individuals. Do you deny that? Karen looked down, gently flipped a page in the file before her, and said nothing. Behind her, a retired Army officer once fined for fishing in uniform sat with arms crossed. Not in uniform this time, just watching. As he left, he told a reporter, I don't need an apology, I just need them not to do it again. Every fragment of the map the HOA once drew, how many centimeters residents could cut their lawns, what kind of flags they could hang, what time birthday parties could start, was now being torn to pieces in front of the very community it once ruled, not by outrage, but by transparency. Standards once accepted as norms were now being forced to justify their existence, and for the first time, no one dared to say, because we've always done it that way, without being challenged. Maurice Langston still hadn't appeared, but the name Langston Lake grew more prominent in every news report as a reminder that some forms of power don't need to be held, only dismantled. And when those once silenced are finally allowed to speak, the ones who once spoke for everyone can no longer find the words. Under the pale yellow lights of the courtroom, Karen slumped forward, eyes blank, staring at the edge of the document in front of her. No more defenses were spoken. No more gestures of denial. She didn't look up. Not toward the prosecutor, not toward the judge, not toward the neighbors and residents she once governed. A heavy stillness filled the courtroom, not the silence of rage or defeat, but the silence that comes when truth is so clear it no longer needs to be explained. Those who had been victims no longer had to shout for justice, because by then, justice stood among them, visible in the judge's firm expression and in the weight of the documents laid bare. An elderly man in the back row closed his eyes and nodded slowly. He had lived here since before Greenfield Lake even had a name, back when the fish still swam freely in water untouched by chemicals. Beside him sat the Asian woman once told to remove her flower pots for being aesthetic violations of HOA culture. A few rows away were the young members of Greenfield Will Not Be Silent, who had dug up and released the discriminatory emails from internal archives. They said nothing. They didn't need to. They just sat there, witnessing an ending that had arrived late, accurately. Above them, the judge's voice rang out, steady and clear. Based on the evidence and testimonies, this court issues a preliminary ruling. The Greenfield HOA is found to have violated 5 federal statutes, including Section 1981 on racial discrimination, Section 2000A on equal access to public accommodations, and clauses on financial transparency, property rights, and the management of public resources. Each statute read aloud landed like a blade, slicing through the layers of justifications the HOA had long used to cloak its authority. The internal regulations that once served as barriers were now declared tools of human rights violations. The community standards once used to quietly exclude were now entered as evidence of systemic discrimination. Given the confirmed misconduct, the judge continued, the Greenfield HOA is hereby ordered to be permanently dissolved. All decisions approved under this entity in the past 5 years will undergo formal review. All public assets that had been unlawfully controlled would be returned to city management. Former board members would be barred from participating in any community organization with administrative power for at least 10 years. No one argued. No one applauded. A ruling like this, in this context, wasn't meant to be celebrated. It was simply an ending, and that was enough. A television reporter in the back row jotted quickly in her notebook. For the first time in state history, an HOA is being fully dissolved due to racial discrimination with no settlements, no ceremonial apology. What had started with a $500 fine for fishing now ended with the dismantling of an entire power structure. Maurice Langston wasn't present for the ruling, just as he hadn't been before. Word was he had gone to the lake early that morning, sitting quietly by the water's edge as usual, holding his old fishing rod and a steaming thermos of tea. He didn't need to witness the end, because he had written it long ago, through quiet resolve, through action instead of reaction, and through a refusal to repeat the wrongs others had learned to tolerate. In the courthouse courtyard, a group of residents held an informal discussion on how to build a new community council, transparent elections, open governance, and no vague clauses about resident standards. One person said, "We're not against HOAs. We're against the idea that they believe they stand above the law." And from that moment, the power map of Greenfield was officially redrawn, not with boundary lines, but with principle: the right to live, to gather, to exist, not measured by name or skin color. No one needed to bow their head when walking past the lake anymore. No one asked, "Am I allowed to sit here?" Because they knew this place belonged to everyone, even those who had once been pushed out of their own homes for failing to match Karen's version of standards. And Karen, at last, came to understand something she had never considered before. Power wasn't something she possessed, it was something the community had once allowed her to borrow. And now, they had taken it back. At the press conference outside the county courthouse, a young reporter from the local television station leaned into the mic, his expression both curious and cautious. He asked, "Do you want Karen to be criminally prosecuted? Do you want her to go to jail?" Maurice Langston paused, sunlight cutting across the face that had once been fined, surveilled, and doubted simply for existing in a place no one thought he belonged. He looked straight into the camera and gave a small shake of his head. "No need for long explanations. I want her to see what she once locked away, now opening, door by door. Each person, each small dream they tried to smother with self-made rules." His answer was not forgiveness, but a declaration that he didn't need revenge to prove justice. The press room fell quiet. The reporter looked down, and a few others lowered their cameras. No one said another word. Inside the courthouse, at that same moment, Greenfield HOA's financial records were released under court order. A 3-page breakdown listed excessive charges for landscape maintenance, special lake management, and exceptional upkeep fees, all drawn from bylaws the HOA had quietly modified over the years without resident votes. Each line in the spreadsheet was an invisible cut the residents had once endured, thinking themselves too small to fight the system. An independent audit confirmed that the total overcharged from households over the past 5 years exceeded $2 million, with over $700,000 collected through rule violations that had no legal basis. The city immediately issued an order to refund that amount to residents, scheduled to begin within 90 days. Each household once cited for walking near the lake outside approved hours, placing a chair in the wrong spot, or planting flowers inconsistent with community aesthetics, would now receive justice in its most practical form, not through apologies, but through action. Media coverage began to shift. No more clickbait headlines like "The Fisherman Who Broke the Internet." Instead, titles carried weight. "Langston Lake, where justice rose from a single unjust citation." People who had once felt crushed by the HOA's grip, who had believed resistance was futile, started writing letters to City Hall, proposing a new self-governing model where decisions would be made through open, public votes, without permanent titles, and with no elite board. As for Maurice, he left the press conference without looking back. He walked along the lake, the same shoreline where he had once been fined $500 for unauthorized fishing. Now, a new sign stood there, white background with blue letters: Langston Lake, community, owned, all residents welcome. Children playing nearby looked up and waved. A middle-aged man nodded in silent thanks. Maurice nodded back, then returned to the small house where he had once been seen as an outsider. He didn't need a courtroom to convict anyone, didn't need handcuffs or sentencing to satisfy pride. For him, the real reckoning was Karen watching the very system she had ruled unravel piece by piece, and that, more than any sentence, was the awakening she needed. In an old drawer, Maurice carefully stored the citation from years ago, the piece of paper that once symbolized anger. Now, it was no longer a wound but evidence of a beginning. He smiled faintly, not because he had won, but because he knew that from now on, no one would be fined for fishing on the very land they called home. A young attorney sat in the back row during the hearing, still green but with clear, steady eyes. In an interview with the local press, he spoke slowly, as if still processing it himself. If no one had bought that lake just because of an unfair fine, all of this would have kept going. Injustice doesn't vanish. It just changes shape. Changes how it presses down through tickets, through vague rules, through meetings where the majority is structured to silence the minority. Maurice didn't just flip the outcome. He broke the false belief that regular people can't stand up to the system. That statement spread across social media as a kind of confirmation from a new generation, those beginning to believe that the law, when used right, can be a tool for reclaiming justice, not just a wall protecting the powerful. That afternoon, with no cameras and no crowd, Maurice left the lawyer's office and walked straight to the lake, now Langston Lake, officially designated by the city as private land with open access, allowing community use without restriction. He moved slowly along the edge of the water, once marked by warning signs, once a place where people were called out and suspected simply for not fitting the HOA image. Now it was where two kids, maybe 7 or 8, laughed loudly, tossing bits of stale bread to the bright fish rising to the surface. Maurice stood a few steps away, saying nothing. The breeze moved gently through the reeds, and the water shimmered as if the lake itself was taking its first breath after years of suffocation. He watched the children, then quietly bent down to pick up an empty bottle someone had left by the shore, slipping it into his coat pocket. No one told him to do it. No one assigned him any role, but something in his eyes made it clear. Someone who has endured silence doesn't walk away from freedom just as it returns. A woman pushing a stroller passed by, paused, and gave a small nod. Maurice nodded back, not speaking. In that stillness, he murmured, unsure if to anyone in particular, sometimes all you need to do is take back what should never have been taken. No one is born to fight, but there are moments when simply existing is seen as a threat. Maurice didn't write new laws, didn't demand apologies or personal reparations. He simply reclaimed what once belonged to everyone, not because the lake had value, but because of the value that had been stripped from it. The right to belong, the right to be present, the right to fish, the right not to be watched for sitting near water on an ordinary afternoon. He didn't need to stand on a podium and declare victory. His victory lived in silence, a kind of silence not forced, not threatened, not cornered. At a far corner of the lake, a group of teenagers was having a small picnic. They played music, laughed, their voices blending with the sound of water lapping against the shore. No one came to check if they had resident ID cards, and no one told them what to wear or how to behave. Maurice stood watching it all, without needing to record anything. The memories of being called on by the police, of being fined and accused were no longer a burden. They had become the reason he kept the lake cleaner, fairer not through restrictions, but through the quiet power of being present. As the sky turned a soft bronze, Maurice headed home. He passed a new sign posted at the head of the trail, public space, no discrimination. He didn't touch it, didn't stop to take a photo. But there was something in the way he walked past that made you believe, if tomorrow someone tried to put up the old private dock, members only sign again, Maurice would return to the lake. And this time, he wouldn't be going alone. In the early days of the new month, around the edge of Langston Lake, the atmosphere felt different from the time it had been bound by invisible rules. The white fences blocking access to the wooden dock were gone, the members-only signs had disappeared, and the watchful, judging glances were nowhere to be seen. In their place were children holding plastic fishing rods, scattered across the grassy banks, their laughter mingling with the quiet splashes of fish snapping at bait below the surface. Maurice Langston sat among them, dressed simply, his gaze calm. He didn't say much, just quietly baited hooks, untangled lines, and showed how to tie knots as if the task were a natural part of the day. A brown-skinned boy, about 8 years old, turned to him and asked with innocent curiosity, "Did you buy the lake just because they fined you?" The question was as gentle as a breeze, but it stirred the weight of an entire story. Maurice looked at the boy, didn't laugh, and didn't give a long explanation. He simply said, "Because no one gets to say you don't deserve the water." The short answer was enough to silence the nearby adults. It wasn't just a response to a child, but the final explanation for everything he had done, from the unjust fine from Karen to silently buying the lake, overturning the HOA's control, and stepping away from titles and praise. He didn't need recognition. He only needed children to grow up, never having to ask that question again. He wanted the lake to no longer be a line between privilege and dignity, between skin color and the right to breathe freely. Maurice never claimed to represent anyone, but in that moment, sitting in the circle of kids, he was the living portrait of what it means to be a true citizen. There were no cameras recording, no live streams, no hashtags tied to that conversation, yet it carried more meaning than 100 viral posts. Because real change doesn't happen on a screen, it starts with how a child comes to understand justice through the actions of an adult. Maurice didn't retell what Karen had done, didn't mention the courtroom or the money. He only spoke of a principle that should have been simple but had been twisted for years: the right to exist, to be present without suspicion. The child looked at him, nodded, then returned to his fishing. The water rippled, reflecting both the sunlight and the fragile trust that was beginning to return to this place. In the distance, a middle-aged woman watched from a stone bench, then turned to her husband and quietly said, "He doesn't need to say anything, but he makes everyone stop and listen." The man nodded, resting a hand on her shoulder. They both understood that what Maurice had done wasn't just a response to Karen, it was a redrawing of the boundary between power and community, between law and decency. He didn't speak to win, he acted to change. And the greatest change was this, that a child could ask why the lake belonged to them instead of fearing they didn't belong at all. That day, no one mentioned Karen's name, and no one brought up the HOA. There was no need. The history of this place had turned a page through an act everyone once thought was reckless, buying an entire lake over a citation. But in truth, it was how one man proved that things seemingly insignificant like the right to fish can become symbols of freedom when taken away for the wrong reason. And when he gave that answer to the child, he wasn't preaching, and he wasn't trying to be a hero. He was simply fulfilling the role of an adult in society to ensure the next generation doesn't grow up asking, "Do I have the right to sit by this water?" But instead grow up knowing with certainty, "I have the right, and no one gets to take that from me." On a still afternoon by Langston Lake, once an invisible front line of control and exclusion, now a natural gathering place for people of all races, ages, and histories, a white-haired elderly woman, slow in step but sharp in gaze, walked toward Maurice. She didn't need to introduce herself. He recognized her, one of the people who had silently nodded along with the HOA in those early meetings, who once opposed with silence. She sat down on the wooden bench beside him, watching the children splashing in the water, and said softly but clearly, "I used to support Karen. I thought she kept order, but I was wrong." Maurice didn't turn to look at her, nor did he show surprise or satisfaction. He simply sat still, letting her speak. "I thought I was protecting the values of the neighborhood, but I confused values with control. I didn't ask questions, and for that, I'm also at fault." Her voice was steady, without excuses, and she wasn't trying to dramatize anything. She hadn't come to be forgiven. She came to acknowledge, and that made the nearby onlookers fall silent for a long moment. It was a confession that needed no applause, yet carried more weight than any headline. Maurice rested his hand on his knee and gave a small nod. That was all she needed, not forgiveness, but a look that didn't turn away. The next day, changes began like a quiet but persistent tide. No one gave instructions, and there were no assignments, but residents started dismantling the white fences put up during the old HOA's tenure fences, not meant for safety, but to mark control. People took down every "no trespassing" sign, every "for residents only" plaque, as if they were stripping away the symbols that had locked them into obedience. Someone brought paint to restore the wooden path to the lake, erasing old words that once dictated who was allowed to step to the water's edge. Children wrote short lines in colored chalk along the railings. "Freedom is fishing with your friend without someone asking for a card." The scattered security cameras around the lake were also taken down, not out of disdain for technology, but because they had been used as tools to monitor the presence of those deemed unfit. A group of young people rebuilt the benches and cleaned areas long abandoned out of fear of violating arbitrary rule. And each action, however small, was a form of resistance, not loud, but powerful enough to erase the culture of control that Karen once called community standard. Maurice didn't organize these efforts, nor did he give instructions. He simply walked around the lake each morning, picking up bits of trash, chatting with elders, and sometimes sitting down to ask children about their homework. But his quiet presence was a clear reminder. People can change a system without creating another system of control. No new leaders were appointed after the HOA was dissolved, yet the community didn't fall into chaos. That's because everyone now understands order doesn't come from bans, but from shared respect. An Asian woman brought small flower pots and replanted them along the path to the lake. She had once been asked by Karen to remove them for being inconsistent with Western aesthetics. Today, she didn't ask for permission, and no one intervened, because now everyone understood that shared space is where every voice and every color of flower deserves to exist. New wooden signs were placed at the lake entrance, listing no laws, citing no regulations, simply stating, "Our place, everyone is welcome." As the evening light stretched across the lake, Maurice stood beneath the tree where it all began. He looked around. No more police, no more HOA, no more need to resist, because what needed to be broken had already fallen, and what needed rebuilding trust and fairness was slowly taking shape. People no longer talked about Karen. They talked about each other, about how someone new was invited to fish like an old friend. They talked about how someone finally spoke up during a meeting, and they understood that even if some once supported Karen, what mattered now was that they were no longer silent. And that alone was enough for a community to start over. Not for one person, but for themselves, the people once divided by unjust rules, now reconnecting with their own hands. On the wooden notice board posted in the center of town, fresh white paint dried around the new words, "Langston Lake, a community's lake." The vote passed almost unanimously. No one objected, no one debated the budget, and no one argued to keep the old name. Everyone knew why. No one had to retell the story, but everyone looked at the lake with a quiet acknowledgement that without Maurice Langston, this lake would still be sealed off by rules no one voted for and boundaries no one dared to name. The town council's resolution wasn't just a document, it was a long overdue recognition of a solitary act fact that sparked a collective awareness. But when the committee representative hand-delivered the invitation, Maurice simply received it, skimmed through it, then placed it on the table without a word. He wasn't angry, wasn't pleased, and didn't avoid it. He responded later with a phone call that held just one sentence. "I don't need a nameplate. I just need no one to be kicked out of here because of their skin color." The dedication ceremony still took place, but the person being honored was absent. Residents gathered by the lake, setting a stone marker engraved with Langston Lake beside a newly restored pinewood walkway, with an inscription below a quote Maurice had once left on a stone bench years ago. "I don't want to be thanked. I want people to be able to fish." Children laughed, adults posed for photos, but amid the celebration, there was still a quiet space, not because Maurice didn't show, but because his absence reminded everyone that his actions were never about credit. That's what made the story a legacy, not a medal. Mrs. Agnes, once a supporter of the HOA, was the first to place flowers at the base of the memorial. She bowed silently, then stepped away from the photo line. Behind her, a young Latino boy visited the lake for the first time with his parents, who had once believed, "This area wasn't for us." Now they knew no one had the right to decide that for them anymore. The media reported on the ceremony, but what spread the fastest was a photo of the stone next to the calm lake. Not because of the name carved into it, but because of everything that had been removed. No more iron fences, no more residents-only signs, no more watchful cameras. Just the lake, open, asking for no cards, requiring no invitation. Maurice wasn't home that day. He drove north to the hills, to a smaller, quieter lake where no one prohibited anything. He dropped bait into the water, no rod, no fish needed, just to hear the peace rise back up from the surface. This world is full of battles. People are forced to choose between speaking up and staying silent, between letting go and holding on. But some battles are simpler, just standing up when someone tells you to sit down. And he chose to stand, not with fists, not with slogans, but with an act no one expected, buying the entire lake so people wouldn't be banned from sitting beside it. Not everyone can do what he did, but everyone can start somewhere. Langston Lake is that kind of beginning. Not to glorify one man, but to remind everyone. Some things were taken just because a few believed they had the right, and some chose to take them back so that no one would have to ask for permission to exist again. On the freshly cleared grass at the south end of Langston Lake, a new sign was raised on a sunny morning. Beneath the bold letters, Langston Lake, a smaller but equally firm line was carved below, "Fish free or die, this water belongs to everyone." The words needed no explanation, no further argument. It was a final declaration, clean, direct, standing in place of lawsuits, meetings, apologies, and explanation. It symbolized a story nearly everyone had heard by now, a black man fined for fishing, who then bought the lake to return freedom to the community. That story was no longer a neighborhood anecdote. It had become the lead segment on the national evening news. The clip of the sign being installed had no long speeches, no loud applause, no hero walking up to accept a medal. Just slow shots, old hands holding the wood beam, rubber hammers driving in nails, kids watching, and townspeople standing quietly. The camera swept across the faces, white, black, Asian, Latinx, all present not to honor one man, but to witness a shared milestone. From a small dispute over fishing rights, it had come to this. And the message etched in wood became the final stop, but also the starting point for hundreds of other communities watching on their screens. A local television editor remarked, "Some revolutions happen in silence. No one yells, no one riots. They just do the right thing and let the action speak." From the town, news of Langston Lake became a new symbol for HOA reform movements. Many other communities began re-examining internal policies, how penalties were enforced, who had access to shared space, and even the language used in violation notices. A state university research team recorded this as the first civil case to trigger HOA policy revisions across 3 neighboring states in a single quarter. But in Langston, people didn't boast about that. They simply started coming to the lake more often to walk, to fish, to picnic, or just to stand by the water, look at the new sign, and know that it was something they had reclaimed. Maurice didn't give interviews. He wasn't at the sign unveiling either. But on the broadcast, amid hundreds of comments, one message stood out: "We're grateful to you, not because you bought the lake, but because you taught us that the right to be present doesn't require permission." That comment was flagged as a highlight and later shown as the closing screen on the weekend news. Within days, the phrase "fish free or die" began trending as a hashtag. It wasn't a threat. It was a new definition of freedom where a person isn't judged by the color of their skin, but respected for their action. That night, in a town hundreds of miles from Langston, a small group of residents held a meeting titled, "Who Owns the Park?" On the table, a woman laid down a printout of the Langston Lake sign, pointed to the engraved words below, and said, "We start here." No one argued. Everyone nodded. They understood that what once seemed minor, like being banned from fishing or asked for ID at a lake, was the beginning of something larger: the right to exist, to speak up, and to share public space without asking permission. Langston Lake is no longer just a lake. It's a mirror, an example, a reminder that justice doesn't need fanfare to begin. It only takes one person refusing to accept injustice. And a wooden sign, quietly standing by the water, can change more than a courtroom ever will. As the evening light falls across the lake, the words, "This water belongs to everyone," reflect in the eyes of newcomers, not asking who they are, only saying, "This water doesn't belong to power. It belongs to those who value freedom." Karen Whitmore spent her final months in the house once considered the heart of the Greenfield neighborhood, now just a moss-covered wall and a patch of grass no one cared to maintain. Her name was removed from every board, every invitation, every internal bulletin. Her presence had been reduced to a faint trace in the neighborhood's past. No one mentioned her, no one needed her. A formal farewell was held in accordance with regulation when she stepped down from her community role, but no one attended except the city's legal representative. The meeting room where she once stood with full confidence announcing penalties and cultural stability measures now echoed only with the sound of a pen signing papers. Karen sat silently, no words, no tears, no one beside her. The representative placed a copy of the resignation document gently in front of her, gave a polite nod, and left. No goodbyes, no thanks. A neighbor across the street, once a vocal supporter of strict HOA rules, told a local reporter she used to think she was the center of everything, like order would collapse without her. But once she stepped back, everything carried on just lighter. In the weeks that followed, Karen's house became a blind spot in the community's memory. No one wanted to look, let alone talk about it. The kids she used to scold for playing near her fence now passed by without turning their heads. The mail carrier stopped knocking, simply dropped letters into the box, and walked away. Karen once controlled every lawn, every trash bin, every small park sign. Now no one needed her approval anymore. There was no news of whether she would move away or stay for good. Some rumors said she was selling the house quietly. Others said she was waiting out the storm behind closed doors. But the truth was, no one cared. That attention had once been power. It had driven people like Maurice away from the lake, made families justify birthday music as cultural noise. Now Karen could open or close her door, and it wouldn't make a difference. People only knew she lived alone, no relatives visiting, no HOA emails to answer at night, no more calls from residents demanding someone be punished. Karen's story gradually faded into the background of the very narrative she once directed, like a controlling playwright, but the play had ended, and she remained behind the torn curtain. No applause, no encore. No one feared her anymore, but no one felt the need to attack either. She was removed from the center of the story by the same silence she once used to smother fragile protest. The difference this time was that the silence didn't frighten anyone. It simply erased her, not with pain or tragedy, but by being replaced with a new order, one where laws weren't tied to skin color, and control no longer came from a seat at the boardroom table. Karen once said, "The law is the law," when she fined Maurice $500 for fishing. Now, no one needs to repeat those words, because her presence no longer affects the water, the kids casting lines, or the people she once excluded from community life. A black woman once denied HOA approval to build a fence for her elderly mother because it didn't match the architectural standard, stood quietly by the lake and said to her daughter, she used to think this lake belonged to her. But the lake doesn't belong to anyone, just like justice doesn't belong to those who speak the loudest. And on the other side of the lake, no one saw Karen anymore. As if the lake had finally returned something to the community no one had dared to demand before equal presence, even in silence. The house that once symbolized power in Greenfield, where Karen Whitmore came and went with a watchful gaze and a commanding voice, was listed quietly for sale. No banner hung at the gate, no agents came repeatedly, just a simple message on the internal channel, property at number 12 has changed ownership. No one in the neighborhood felt regret, no one stopped to glance, and no one asked who would move in next, because what they remembered wasn't the image of the house, but the years they lived under rules imposed in the name of civility. One resident said, "We don't hate the house, but no one wants to see it anymore." When the last moving truck left, no one waved. No one stood by, as if the whole neighborhood had silently agreed to a quiet departure. That house used to decide what trees could be planted, whether a house color met the standard, and where kids could play in the park. It was where dozens of emails were sent daily with harsh language to suppress differences growing quietly within the community. And now, with no one reading emails from that address, no one fined for watering plants at the wrong time, the lake across the street was finally still. Maurice Langston said nothing more about Karen after she disappeared from the neighborhood. He never brought up her name in any conversation, not with lawyers, not with the press. When asked, he simply shook his head and said, "Not necessary," because he knew silence was also an ending. An ending that didn't require a courtroom, didn't need a sentence, just a natural vanishing once control stopped being upheld by fear. Maurice still came to the lake every morning, sometimes with a few kids casting lines. He sat by the water, where the Langston Lake sign had become an inseparable part of the town. But he never looked back at the house Karen once lived in, nor did he mention her in any story. Not because he tried to forget, but because no one needed to hold on to a memory that only brought limits and exclusion. For Maurice, the lake was what mattered, a place where everyone had the right to be, fish, to walk, without being asked for a card, judged by a name, or questioned for where they came from. And when the water was still, when children ran around without anyone approving the noise, when neighbors greeted each other by first names instead of family names in records, Maurice knew he didn't need to say anything more to prove the right thing had won. Karen's departure wasn't marked by a television program or a farewell from the community. No flowers were sent, no speeches made, and no news segment called it a regrettable goodbye. It was just a line in the neighborhood's history, a line people turned past, remembered, but didn't mourn. And for Maurice, not mentioning Karen anymore wasn't erasure, it was making space for new sounds to rise, the splash of fish, the laughter of children, the free footsteps circling the lake without fear. She was once the center, now just a name that vanished. Maurice was once the outsider, now the only one who no longer needs to prove he belonged. Because the lake has gone quiet, and that silence carries no bitterness, it stands as proof of a new order, where people don't need permission to live as who they are, and that is enough. No one feels sorry, no one looks back, and that is exactly how every unjust power should end. One early summer afternoon, the surface of Langston Lake flected the sunlight like a giant mirror. A breeze skimmed across the water, lifting a few dry leaves that had fallen from the oak trees surrounding the lake. Maurice Langston sat at his usual spot on the rocky bank, fishing rod resting nearby, a cup of lukewarm tea in hand. Beneath the shade, a white teenage boy, thin and still sweaty from biking, walked over. He stood in silence for a moment, then said hesitantly, awkwardly, "I don't know how to fish." Maurice looked up, not judging, more like reading the stillness in the boy's mind. He didn't ask his name, didn't ask why he was there. He simply leaned over, picked up the second rod, and handed it over. "This water doesn't require skill, only patience." The boy sat down, hesitant to touch the rod at first, like he might disrupt a space meant only for people who know what they're doing. But when Maurice gently dropped his line into the water, the boy followed, hands slightly trembling. No one asked if he was a resident, if he had a membership card, or whether his parents had paid dues. No one demanded a permit or checked his background. There was only the lake, two people sitting beside each other, and the breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass from the park across the shore. After a while, the boy turned and said softly, "I used to be scared to come near. My mom said if you didn't have a card, you'd get fined." Maurice smiled, eyes still on the water. "And do you have a card now?" The boy shook his head. "Good," Maurice said, "because this place doesn't need cards anymore." The quiet between them didn't create distance. It built trust, a kind that had never existed here when it was still called Greenfield Lake. A black man was once kicked out for fishing at the wrong time. A white teenager once taught that everything came with conditions. Now, they sat together, not to erase differences, but to share something simple. "This water belongs to everyone. Do you think I'll catch one?" the boy asked, eyes bright beneath the slanting sun. Maurice nodded. "If you're patient and quiet enough for the fish to trust you." Farther down the shore, a few adults looked over at them, some familiar faces, some new to the neighborhood. No one walked over to remind. No one whispered warning. They just watched and understood that this simple moment was the real end of the old era. Not the court rulings, not the fines, not the speeches or thick case files, but a boy sitting next to someone the system once taught him to fear, to avoid, to verify before trusting. The rod twitched. The boy gave a small tug. A fish nibbled, then slipped away. He laughed. "I lost it." Maurice didn't scold, just said, "The fish aren't here to be caught. They're here to show you what's still alive." The boy went quiet, gripping the rod a little firmer. Behind them the new sign still stood, bold and clear. Langston Lake, fish free or die. This water belongs to everyone. No one needed to be on a list, sign a form, or ask for permission to sit by that lake. Free presence was enough. And in every small movement between two generations, one who had once been pushed aside and one just learning to enter a world no longer shaped by fear, Greenfield was truly reborn. No membership cards, no barriers, no invisible fences, only patience, silence, and one simple lesson. The right to belong doesn't need to be proven, it's a right that was always there. They sat together, saying nothing. No instructions, no words of reassurance or reminders. Only the sound of water brushing the shore, and the occasional creak of a fishing rod in the breeze. The boy still held the rod, eyes fixed on the lake like he was seeing a whole new world, one without warnings or judging, stares from those who used to decide who got to exist where. Maurice sat the same way he always did, calm as the lake after a storm, needing no more words, because the boy sitting next to him was proof enough that the old system Karen and the HOA built had lost its power. Not because anyone erased it, but because no one believed in it anymore. That silence was something the HOA never managed to create. During all the years Maurice lived here, what Karen called community order always came with noise, complaints, doors slammed when someone the wrong color walked by, police calls for people too close to the lawn. That kind of silence was fear disguised, the hush of people who knew they weren't welcome, who kept their heads down just to get by. But this silence was acknowledgement, the retreat of prejudice, no need for warnings, yet everyone existed side by side. The lake didn't need a new law or banners. It was too natural to be regulated, and that stillness, not any defense or political speech, was the strongest proof that control had ended. A strong wind passed, carrying the smell of wild grass by the lake. The boy turned to look at Maurice for the first time, really look, not out of curiosity, but to understand how someone once pushed out of this place could now sit so calmly, as if he had been born there. Maurice didn't explain. His silence was the only thing left when every argument had already been made through action. Beneath them, grass had grown through the old footpaths the HOA had once paved over to keep people from walking. On a nearby oak tree, someone had taken down the no gathering sign and tied a green ribbon with the lake's new name, not for decoration, but as a reminder that this place belonged to everyone. A young mother walked by with her daughter, paused to greet Maurice, then bent down to remind her child, "Don't forget to say thank you for us still being able to walk around the lake today." The little girl looked up, not fully understanding, but still whispered a shy thank you. Maurice nodded gently. The teenage boy remained seated, watching every small motion like it was part of a documentary playing out before him. No one told him what to do. No one asked him to prove anything. The lake, once the centerpiece of every rulebook demand, was now the only place teaching people how to listen just by being there. That silence spread across the lake, as if every patch of soil, every branch, every fish beneath the surface knew they were coming alive for the first time after years of being confined. The silence carried no fear, no trace of anger. It had only one tone: freedom. A freedom that didn't need statements or parades, just a teenager sitting beside someone who had once been banned from being there, both breathing air no longer boxed in by regulation. Maurice set his tea down on the ground, stood up, dusted off his hands, then looked out over the lake like someone who had just planted a seed and knew it would grow the right way. The boy stayed seated, asking nothing more, because now he understood. The places worth staying in aren't defined by polished signs or tight fences, but by the simple truth that even silence can be a welcome for everyone. The story of Maurice Langston appeared on a national podcast, where the host opened with a statement that cut straight to the core of the fight. Langston didn't win because of power. He won because he refused to play by the oppressor's rule. Listeners weren't just curious about how a man fined for fishing ended up owning an entire lake, but were drawn into the deeper layers beneath it. A man who didn't need to declare war to win, didn't need to destroy the system, only needed to remove one nail at a time with patience and truth. The podcast was widely shared. In community law classes, Maurice Langston's name was added to a special section titled, "When the Law Doesn't Need Power, Only Resolve." The curriculum presented the story as proof that an individual can overturn institutional imposition not through violence or slogans, but by understanding the law more clearly than those who created it. Students were assigned to study Langston's legal filing, comparing them with federal and state codes, to see how sometimes the law itself isn't flawed, but the way people use it throws justice off balance. Meanwhile, in the town of Greenfield, Langston Lake was no longer a battleground, but a meeting place for things that once seemed unable to exist side by side. A white boy learning to fish with an old man once banned from the shoreline by the HOA, an elderly woman who once voted in favor of the HOA now leading the lakeside gardening group, a maintenance worker once fined for using the wrong flower colors, now free to choose the plants for each corner. The story didn't end with a monument or parade. It ended with quiet, irreversible changes where each person learned to live in a community where the law isn't a fence, but a promise that no one will be pushed aside for being different. Maurice didn't take part in any forums, didn't appear on television interviews, and didn't write a book. He appeared only once in a short video clip, captured as he lifted a large rock and tossed it from the edge of the lake where a no trespassing sign used to be. When asked why he kept cleaning a place he had already won, Maurice replied simply, "I'm not cleaning it because I won, I'm cleaning it because I live here." The quote was shared widely. In urban policy panels, his name became linked with the concept of decentralized grassroots civic action. But to Maurice, nothing about it was symbolic. He was just a resident, and what he did was simply to return the lake to where it belonged, a part of the community, not the property of a self-appointed few. Someone once asked, "Aren't you angry at them?" Maurice stayed silent for a long time before answering. "I used to think the right thing to do was to fight for justice, but then I realized what matters more is giving back to others what they should have had, even if they never stood with me." That answer, more than any defense or rebuttal, redefined the entire journey. The story of Maurice Langston, the man once fined for fishing, came to a close, not with a triumphant victory, but with a quiet act, placing a piece of justice back where it had been taken. And that wasn't revenge. That was restoration. A small stone marker sits by the lake, quietly nestled among green grass, and the wind rippling the surface. There are no flowers, no candles, no sign of a tribute. Just a gray slab engraved with the words, "This lake was once private, now it belongs to the silence of dignity." The message isn't meant to stir emotion or proclaim victory. It simply states a truth: the lake was once fenced off by imagined authority, by people who believed the law was a tool to keep others from a shoreline. Now, it belongs to something that can't be owned, the silence of dignity, reclaimed by those once denied, dismissed, or questioned because of the color of their skin, and who refused to accept it one more time. Every morning, people still come to fish. No crowds, no banners, no protests, just folding chairs, old coffee thermoses, and the casual flick of fishing lines, as if no one had ever been banned from this place. No one asks, "Who are you to sit here?" No one checks addresses, no one scans a stranger with judgment. That is the quietest victory, when the presence of those once pushed out no longer needs an explanation. And in that normalization lies the purest form of justice. Not everyone has to be a hero, not everyone has to win a court case. Some only need to open a space, then step aside so others can move forward without resistance. Under the shade of a willow by the lake, a brown-skinned boy sits next to an older man, learning how to bait a hook without dropping it too fast. The man doesn't need an introduction. The boy doesn't need to know who he is. And no one brings up the days when the lake was divided by signs and access fees, because that no longer exists. This lake is no longer a symbol of conflict or a trophy of victory. It's just a place where people can sit side by side in undisturbed quiet. Those who once enforced the rules are gone, leaving behind only outdated reports and cracked regulation. And those who were once pushed to the edge haven't claimed new control. They've simply reopened a gate. A middle-aged Latin couple brought their child to release fish into the water. They had once left because they couldn't endure the surprise inspections and unreasonable fines. Now they were back, without needing anyone's permission. An elderly Asian woman, once ordered by Karen to remove her flower bed for being an aesthetic misfit for the neighborhood, had replanted the exact same flowers right by the lake. A white teenager who had once been afraid to stand with Maurice now brought his whole study group to pitch tents, set up a small grill, just to spend a quiet day together. No one organized it, no one led it, no one needed directions. Everyone knew what to do, and that knowing unspoken, formed in the silence that followed everything, is something the HOA never managed to create. Maurice no longer showed up often. People only saw him once a week, walking around the lake like any other resident. No one came up to shake hands or ask for a photo. He once said, "I don't want to be a role model, I want to be a neighbor." And that line stayed unchanged, without the need for exclamation marks. He didn't need to retell the past. Those who lived through it already knew. Those who were new didn't need to, because they were living in the version that had already been rewritten. And that was the best part. One autumn morning, as leaves began to drift down onto the water, a black girl sat fishing beside an old white-haired man reading a book. When asked, "Do you know who bought the lake?" the girl shook her head. "Number, but I know anyone can fish here." And maybe that was the best ending for a story that had started with a fine and a suspicious glance. Now, the lake needed no guards, no membership cards, no one to validate another's worth. It only needed the water and people who believed that everyone had a right to sit beside it, quietly and equally. Langston Lake was no longer just a body of water sitting still inside a once-closed neighborhood. It stood as proof that power was no longer about a board seat or a rusty "no entry" sign nailed into a post. It became a place where one man, without shouting or demanding consensus, changed an entire community simply by refusing to step back. Maurice Langston wasn't the kind of hero standing in front of cameras. When reporters came, he didn't take interviews. When the Langston Lake sign went up, he declined to give a speech. The only line he left behind was, "I don't need my name on it. I need people to stay without needing permission." That sentence became the mirror to the entire story, that what had been stolen wasn't the right fish, but the right to simply exist in a space once ruled by suspicion, exclusion, and fear. Karen Whitmore once believed she controlled the lake, but what she really controlled was the fear of the residents. She made them believe that certain people didn't belong in the culture of Greenfield, that certain sounds didn't fit when they came from a black family's yard, that certain skin tones didn't deserve to be near the water. Maurice didn't fight back with anger. He chose to buy the very thing they used to control others and give it back to everyone, not for revenge, but to close the gate that had once divided people in the same neighborhood. That journey began with a citation. A golf cart stopped by the lake. A man sat quietly with a fishing rod, and a woman believed her authority was enough to take away someone else's present. No one in the neighborhood thought that moment would lead to a state-level investigation, the dissolution of the HOA, the renaming of a lake, and a community reclaiming itself. This story didn't erupt with gunfire or protests, but with the steady resolve and legal clarity of a citizen who refused to be treated like an outsider in his own home. Maurice wasn't looking to win in court. He sought to dismantle the system that let people like Karen manipulate laws and the vulnerable under the guise of rules. That was the deeper victory, forcing power to answer for what it had done, not with rage, but with justice. After the final hearing, Karen wasn't sentenced to prison, but the community turned its back on her. Her silence during those final sessions, the hollow testimonies of former supporters, was the most fitting end. No one needed to see her fall. People just needed to know that from now on, no one would have to ask permission to exist in a place that should belong to all. The real lessons aren't in the investigation files. They show up in the look of a child fishing with their father without being asked, "What house do you live in?" In the relief of an Asian nurse no longer forced to uproot her garden for aesthetic reasons, in the quiet act of an elderly white woman, once a supporter of the HOA, now removing the no trespassing signs put up when Karen was in charge. If anything should be underlined at the end of this story, it's this: every freedom begins when one person refuses to stay silent. Maurice didn't change the law. He forced the law to function the way it was written. He didn't argue for a voice. He made the entire community hear their own voice again, the one long muffled under the names of order and stability. Langston Lake isn't just a lake. It's the place where one man proved that sometimes, fix a broken system, you don't need to make noise. You just need to not step back. And when others see you standing there, they begin to walk forward.